Welcome to the Lesson 12 Workbook exercise video for Hebrew 1 and 2, Write Old Testament 502-504 online edition. Today we're going to be continuing our study of imperfect verbs, but looking at weak stems, and how those stems behave when we add on the prefixes and suffixes of the imperfect form. So let's get started. As per usual, I'm not going to run through the whole list of parsings in the first set of exercises. However, I do want to single out three: number 5, number 7, and number 10, because these are a little different. So beginning with number 5, how would we parse this particular verb? This first verb is a cal imperfect second person feminine singular from chazak. We have a tav prefix and a yod suffix, which indicates that this is second person feminine singular. Our first root letter is a chet, which is a guttural, so that under normal circumstances, with a strong verb, we would expect a hirik underneath the tav and a silent shva underneath the chet. However, because it's a guttural, we would often have a segol shva underneath the chet, but because of the way that gutturals act when you put a suffix onto the end of this verb, it becomes simply a segol, and the hirik underneath the tav also becomes a segol. This is an unusual form, but it's very common for weak verbs. If you drop down to number 10, which we'll get to in just a moment, you see the same process taking place, but with A-class vowels. What about number 2? How do we get nomar out of the root amar? The verb here, nomar, comes from the root amar, to say, and is a 1CP verb indicated by the nun prefix. The holum over the aleph has caused the aleph to quiesce so that the nun and the aleph form one syllable, no. Instead of having a hirik under the nun and a holum over the mem, as we would expect in a strong root, this is one of the angry baker verbs, a first consonant aleph, or a one aleph, or ayin aleph, as it's sometimes called, indicating that we have a different form. The angry baker verbs will take a O-class vowel over the initial aleph, and then a or I-class short vowel underneath the mem, either a segol or a patak, occasionally a seire, so that yomer, where we have a yod prefix, a 3ms, is actually one of the most common forms of the imperfect in the entire Old Testament. Here, instead of yomer, we have nomar, where we still have the same idea of the holum over the aleph, but with the nun prefix instead of a yod. We've already talked a little bit about this last verb, number 10, as it's very similar to number 3, the first one that we did in this set of exercises, except instead of segols, we have pataks. So go ahead and give that one a try. Much like we saw in number 3, this is a third masculine plural with a yod prefix and a shurik suffix. It comes from the root azav. Again, we would expect an I-class vowel under the yod and a silent shva under the ayin. Instead, because it's an ayin, which is a guttural, we get an A-class vowel. Oftentimes, when we have a shva under an ayin, we will get a patak shva, but here we have simply the patak, and then the hirik underneath the yod also changes to patak in order to correspond to the patak under the ayin, so that we get ya'azvu instead of the form that we would expect within the strong verb. Hopefully this has made sense. If not, go back and review this section of your textbook to understand the unique forms of some of these weak stems. In this next set of exercises, you are asked to do the odd exercises, translating the Hebrew into English. So go ahead and try number 1. The first sentence begins with baboker, in the morning, with the bait preposition in, with the definite article patak underneath the bait. We then have tishlach, you will send, a 2ms verb from shalach, to send. The tav indicates that this is 2ms as the prefix on shalach. Send, will send, followed by the direct object marker, your son, My apologies for changing the final cough to a nun. Again, my computer does not like cough, so the nuns are at least close. You will send direct object marker your son, and then another direct object marker your daughter, both of which should have the cough marker indicating possession, your son, your daughter, followed by a pronoun to habayit, the house. Definite article on the word bayit. You will send your son and your daughter to the house. Go ahead and try number 3. Number 3 begins with the verb we will trust, niv tak, not niv tok. Again, we don't have a holum over the tate. We have an A-class vowel under the tate because of the presence of the chet, the guttural, at the end of the verb. The nun prefix indicates that this is a 1 CP. We will trust. We then are followed by the bait preposition in, shame, name, in a name, but this is in a name of Yahweh. And since Yahweh is definite, this is the name of Yahweh. And then in construct with Tsavaot, of armies, of hosts. We will trust in the name of Yahweh of hosts. We will trust in the name of the Lord of hosts. Go ahead now and try number 5. The answer to number 5 begins with a verb, you will find, from matzah, the tav and the shuric suffix indicating that this is a 2MP, you will find, and then we have the direct object marker of what you will find. You will find the servant. We know that this is the servant because after servant we have the word melech. Again, the cough is missing because of my silly computer, but this is the king, so this is the servant of the king, the definite article referring to both parts of the construct phrase, the construct clause, and you will find them in the temple or in the palace. Again, you will find the servant of the king in the temple. Go ahead and try the last one here on the page, which is number 7 in your workbook. In this particular case, the subject is fronted, ha-na'arim, the young men, and then we have a third person masculine plural, they will perish, with the yod prefix and the shuric suffix. Coming from the verb avad, here we have the holum over the aleph, because this is one of the angry baker verbs. You have to eat my food or you will perish. So there, instead of having a I-class vowel under the yod and the O-class vowel over the bait, instead we have an O-class vowel over the aleph and a seire under the bait. Yo vedu. We then finish with in the battle. The definite article is underneath the bait preposition, malchama. We see that then the young men will perish in the battle. I'm not going to go over as many of the examples from the exercises here in this second section, what is listed as 16B in your workbook, because so many of them are similar to the ones you already did in 16A. However, this section of weak verbs loses letters, so I want to go through and make sure that you understand why they're losing letters so that you can identify these root stems. The first one here is actually not the first one in your exercise. It is actually number 7 in your exercises. Look at number 7 and determine how you would parse this particular verb. This is a good example as to why vocabulary comes in handy, because the word is roots, to run. However, we have an A-class vowel under the preformative, but the fact that there is a preformative, a yod, tells us that this is a third masculine singular imperfect verb. We have the preformative that indicates that it's a imperfect. That's the clue, even though there's an A-class vowel, which we would expect more in a cal perfect. However, again, the word is not yarats, the word is roots. Knowing that vocabulary helps us to identify this verb correctly as an imperfect. The rest of these are weak, and they're weak in different ways than the first set of weak verbs that we did in the first section of this chapter. So go ahead and try number 2, which is another weak verb, a one nun verb. This second example, which is actually number 9 in your exercises, is fairly typical of one nun verbs. In fact, it's also typical of one lamed verbs. If the verb in question is lakach, to take, that verb also likes to pretend like it's a one nun verb, where the first letter, the nun, will ball itself up and go into the pay, or assimilate into the pay. Technically, neither of those is correct, but we say each of those phrases, either balling itself up into the pay or assimilating into the pay, in order to remind students how exactly this works. Basically, the nun has dropped, and we have doubled the pay in order to close the previous syllable, so that that previous syllable can keep its short vowel. Otherwise, the yod in the vowel would be a open syllable, which would require a long vowel. We don't want that, we want the short vowel, so we add the dagesh in the pay. That doubles the pay, closing the syllable. The dagesh is not the nun, the dagesh is not the lamed in lachak, the dagesh is simply a dagesh. It is doubling the pay. But if it helps you to remember that it's an assimilated nun, or that the nun has balled itself up into the pay, well then good, go ahead and use that explanation. This is what will often happen in one nun verbs, and so you need to be familiar with the pattern. The yod at the beginning of the verb and the shurik at the end of the verb show us that this is third masculine plural. What about the next verb? How do we parse that one? The root for this verb is yashav, yod, shin, beit, not shuv, shin, shurik, beit, meaning to return, but yashav, meaning to dwell. We have the tav prefix and the yod suffix, which indicates that this is a cal imperfect second feminine singular. However, the yod from yashav has assimilated with the vowel underneath the tav to form a seirei. Instead of it being tav plus a hirik plus a yod, we have tav plus a seirei. So we get teshavi instead of tishavi. Go ahead and try the next one. This next example is number 12 in your workbook. You typically don't do number 12 because we only do the odd examples. However, natan, which is the root for this particular verb, is so common that I felt it necessary to review this one. We have here nun, tav, nun, but the first nun has disappeared. We then put a dagesh into the tav to maintain that short vowel into the previous tav. The tav prefix coupled with the yod suffix means that this is a cal imperfect second person feminine singular, and again it is from natan. In some cases, both nuns will drop, and you'll just be left with the tav of the root. Those are very tricky, but again, you should become used to seeing this because it seems like every page has natan on it in the Hebrew text. The verb here is a cal imperfect third person feminine singular, second person masculine singular. The verb root is nasa, to lift or to raise. We've dropped the nun from the verb and doubled the sin instead to close that first syllable. Vocab will certainly help in this particular situation, but also noticing the dagesh will tell us that there is a nun involved that has disappeared, which helps us figure out the root. We have the tav prefix, which tells us the 3fs, 2ms. So let's take a look at our final one here. This is a cal imperfect 3ms from kala. I've chose this one, number 29 in your workbook exercises, on purpose because of the fact that this is an imperfect third hey verbs. Imperfect third hey verbs in the third person masculine singular will always end in segol hey. It's just one of the quirks of the language, which makes identification much easier. We will have a segol hey at the end of the word. Of course, that assumes that there's no objects, but having that segol hey at the end of the word shows us we are dealing with a third hey verb. The different vowels will show up in the other stems and the other tenses, which is very helpful for our purposes. Well, that brings us to the end of our current set of exercises. Continue to review and learn these weak verb patterns well, because they're going to show up in all the Hebrew verb stems in the next several weeks.